I turned 18, our kin resolved one winter to embark on a camping venture in Arizona. The winters were not bitingly frigid, so we journeyed up into the mountains. Though I wasn't enthusiastic about camping, I was coerced into joining, as we found ourselves within this dim and vacant forest. The only visible entities were towering desiccated trees and a faint frost along the grass tips. That night, my boredom led me to crave exploration while my family set up the tents. I plunged into the obscure depths of the night, a chilling breeze murmuring through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. Obviously, fear gripped me, but my imprudent self chose to press on. The moon loomed like a cold, pallid eye in the sky, casting eerie shadows that waltzed across the ground. I felt an irresistible pull toward the dilapidated residence. At the terminus of a lengthy corridor made of trees, a place emanating dreadful vibes. Curiosity incessantly nudged me forward, compelling me toward the decaying front entrance. The wood groaned under my weight as I pushed it ajar, unveiling a corridor shrouded in darkness. The air hung heavy with a musty scent, redolent of decay and the passage of time itself. Activating my flashlight, its beam pierced the blackness, exposing walls adorned with peeling wallpaper. As I delved further into the dwelling, the floorboards beneath me groaned, seemingly protesting my intrusion. The corridor guided me to a door, partially open, exposing a room bathed in a sickly red glow. My heart raced as I entered, my breath catching at the unsettling tableau before me. Candles adorned the room, casting shadows that flickered upon the walls. In the room's center lay a horrific scene, a body, gruesomely torn apart in unimaginable ways. Blood stained the floor, forming ghastly patterns pulsating with malevolent energy. The stench became overwhelming, a sickly sweet amalgamation of iron and decay, nearly inducing a gag reflex. My gaze remained fixated on the grotesque sight, limbs contorted at unnatural angles, entrails strewn across the floor like a twisted masterpiece. The walls themselves seemed to exude dread, as if the very essence of the room had been tainted by the violence that had occurred within. A guttural sound emanated from the shadows, and I spun around, my flashlight beam revealing only darkness. Panic seized me as I realized I was not alone. Something lurked in the corners, reveling in the pain and suffering that had transpired here. A whisper brushed against my ear. I see fingers trailing down my spine. My breath hitched as the words infiltrated my mind. A litany of horrors, a symphony of despair. Panic urged me to flee, but my feet felt rooted to the blood-soaked floor. In that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon something incomprehensible, a darkness that transcended the boundaries of our world. As the room seemed to constrict around me, I realized that the terrors of the dwelling were not confined to its deteriorating walls. They had taken root in my very soul, forever binding me to the malevolent presence that hungered for more. I underwent therapy for months after that night, and still endure nightmares and visions that transport me back to that horrid dwelling. Even years later, I remain clueless about the events that unfolded there. At that moment, I knew I had stumbled upon something beyond comprehension, a darkness that defied the limits of our world. As the room seemed to close in around me, I realized that the horrors of the house were not confined to its decaying walls. They had taken root in my very soul, forever binding me to the malevolent presence that hungered for more. As I struggled with fear, an indescribable sensation overcame me, a fusion of physical pain and mental anguish that seemed to transcend any ordinary human suffering. Over the years that followed, I was haunted by increasingly terrifying and disturbing visions. The malevolent house became a prison for my mind, where I was tortured by shadowy and unknown entities. Each night was a harrowing journey into the unknown, where screams echoed through endless corridors, and distorted faces watched me with empty eyes. My life slowly unraveled, as the shadows intertwined with my existence. Relationships crumbled, a career evaporated, and sanity slipped through my fingers. Every effort to escape this curse proved futile, and I found myself trapped in an endless cycle of supernatural horror. The desperate search for answers revealed only fragments of a more sinister truth, and the line between reality and nightmare became increasingly blurred. It was not just the house that was cursed, but myself, condemned to wander among the shadows, eternally pursued by forces beyond human understanding. Years later, as I continued to grapple with my own agony, the house stood as a monument to evil, a prison for unsuspecting souls who dared to cross its threshold. What happened that night continued to resonate, not only within the blackened walls of the house, but in my tortured existence, where the boundary between life and death faded into an endless nightmare. The notion of camping always entertained me. Sitting by the fire at night and chatting with friends, roasting marshmallows and sipping drinks, all while being surrounded by nature. Something about it seemed so tranquil. I shared my thoughts with a few close friends, and they all responded positively to the idea. We decided to make it happen and drove out to the woods the next weekend. Alex, Marina, Peter, Michael, and I were all excited and had packed the car with supplies for the upcoming 3 days. It really was as enjoyable as I imagined, and during our first night, we stayed up until almost 3 a.m. The second day was when things started going wrong. I woke up at around 6 a.m., which, considering the circumstances, wasn't particularly weird. What startled me, though, was the silence, the complete and surreal silence. It felt like I had gone deaf. I couldn't hear anything. No wind, trees rustling, or my friends breathing. A paralyzing fear enveloped me, and I didn't dare to move, attributing it to being in the woods. The woods really can play tricks on your mind. I must have fallen back asleep because I woke up to Marina, looking down at me, just inches from my face. I almost screamed and asked her what the heck she was doing, but she just laughed it off. Aside from that, the day continued on as normal. It was actually really fun. When it got late in the evening, Michael and I both had to pee, one of the less fun things to do while camping. So, we walked away together to find a suitable place. The darkness surrounded us, and I really had to concentrate on where to put my feet so I didn't trip over some roots. Marina suddenly screamed, and I nearly ran to her to find out what had happened. She looked mortified and stared at something on the ground while holding something in her hand. I focused my eyes on the thing she looked at, and when my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I saw the outlines of bones. Human bones. I screamed as well, a scream of pure horror, and looked up at Marina. In her hand, she held one of the bones. But what I looked up at wasn't Marina. Her face had morphed into something that didn't look human. Her cheeks had sunken into her face, and she looked lifeless, pale, and dull. She opened her mouth, and a scream higher than any human should be able to make escaped from her. I froze and just stared at her, convinced I was dreaming. She fell down to the ground and started to shake uncontrollably. I screamed for Alex, Peter, and Michael, and they all came running. Marina had stopped moving and rested lifeless on the ground. Alex screamed at me, demanding to know what had happened. Everything was chaos. It wasn't easy, but we all managed to calm down a bit, just so we could gather ourselves and actually talk about what just happened. We inspected Marina's body, and that was when I noticed it. Her right hand was badly burned, with redness and blisters on it. It was such a contrast to the rest of her now pale body that it was impossible to miss. I connected the dots. That's the hand she was holding the bone with. That was it for me. I wanted to leave right that second. We left as soon as we managed to, leaving Marina and almost all of our stuff behind. I sat quietly in the car and stared out of the window. I heard Michael breathing excessively behind me. in the back seat, and I turned around, thinking he was stressed. His eyes were wide open, and he stared down at his hands. He claimed he felt funny and started breathing even faster. I looked down at his lap, where his hands rested. A human bone rested in his hands, seemingly a rib. My blood turned to ice, and I acted on instinct. I slapped the bone out of his hands, and it flew out of the open car window. I then swore to myself that I never would return here. We arrived home about 10 minutes ago. I'm relieved to be home, but I can't help but think I really missed that forest. However, as the days passed, I began to notice changes in myself. Terrifying nightmares haunted me every night, replaying the gruesome events of that fateful camping night. My mind seemed increasingly fragmented, and I found myself losing touch with reality. A month after the camping trip, I started noticing strange marks on my skin, similar to the ones Marina had on her burned hand. As these marks spread, a constant burning sensation accompanied every waking moment. Soon, my health began to deteriorate rapidly, and no doctor could find an explanation for the bizarre symptoms I was experiencing. Desperate, I sought the help of experts in supernatural phenomena, and that's when I was told a chilling tale about the forest we visited. It was said to be haunted by vengeful spirits of ancient inhabitants, and any intrusion into their territory would result in a merciless curse. Those who dared disturb the spirits' peace were marked for a life of torment and suffering. Now, trapped in a living nightmare, I realized that the forest not only left us physically, but also seized something much deeper. The attraction I felt for that serene place has turned into a curse that has corroded my life, turning it into an eternal agony. Longing for the forest has become a bitter desire, a wish to escape this terrible condemnation that seems to have no end. This recounts an eerie tale of peculiar events that unfolded several years ago near Moonlit Pond. To provide some context, my relatives, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, have a tradition of annual camping trips, spanning 4 days, the first for camp setup, the second and third for routine camping, and the last for packing. Given the abundance of hills in our locale, we alternated between camping spots. Moonlit Pond was one such place, a serene location with sparse thickets and minimal wildlife, creating a tranquil atmosphere. During our leisure time, we often embarked on hikes along the trails. On this particular occasion, we set out later than usual, armed with flashlights and headlamps in anticipation of impending darkness. As we traversed a familiar trail, an unexplored path unfolded before us. It was remarkably wide, allowing all 12 of us to stand shoulder to shoulder with room to spare. Thick forests flanked the path, an unusual sight in this typically thin woodland. Intrigued by its novelty, we unanimously decided to explore this new route. After approximately 40 minutes, darkness descended. Determined to proceed, we activated our light sources, only to find them extinguished simultaneously after a few minutes. In the ensuing darkness, whispers of confusion echoed. Amidst the uncertainty, I heard rustling from the dense forest to my right. Suddenly, all lights were restored. My superstitious family, particularly my grandmother, deemed it wise to reverse our course. We sprinted halfway back to the campsite and, deeming it safe, resumed walking. Upon reaching the campsite, we lit a fire, prepared food, and relaxed. The bizarre incident with our lights remained unspoken, and eventually, the time came for everyone to retire for the night. Inside my tent, I struggled to sleep, the rustling in the forest lingering in my mind. The tent's fine mesh windows revealed a small gap, allowing me to peer outside. I lay awake, acutely aware of every nocturnal sound, crickets, bugs, and distant coyote howls. Abruptly, an eerie silence enveloped the night, interrupted only by approaching footsteps. Initially dismissing it as someone relieving themselves, I soon realized it was something more sinister. The footsteps circled the campsite for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed with fear. I mustered the courage to glance through the window gap. A tall figure with bent knees loomed outside. It halted, and dread consumed me. Although it eventually departed, its lingering gaze haunted my thoughts. Exhausted, I succumbed to sleep. Upon waking, normalcy returned. We resumed our routine, talking, cooking, and simply existing. Later, we decided to revisit the mysterious path, only to find it vanished, replaced by fully grown trees. Perplexed, we returned to the camp, reluctant to leave its comforting embrace. The next day, as we departed, the mysterious occurrence was left unspoken. Years later, we decided to make another trip to the same place. The journey started off normally, but as we approached the trail that would lead us to the site of the strange path, we noticed something unusual. The weather began to change rapidly, the sky darkened ominously, and heavy clouds formed overhead. When we reached the area where the mysterious path used to be, we were shocked to find not fully grown trees, but an empty and silent clearing. A sense of unease settled in, and the atmosphere became charged with a strange energy. Ignoring the warnings from the past, we decided to continue exploring. As we ventured into the clearing, a dense fog began to envelop us, obscuring our vision. A feeling of restlessness overcame the group, and the air grew tense. Suddenly, we started hearing whispering voices around us in distinct murmurs. Echoing through the empty clearing, we tried to rationalize, attributing the sounds to natural phenomena, but the feeling that we were not alone persisted. As night fell, the voices intensified, becoming clearer and more disturbing. Unsettling shadows danced around the periphery of the clearing, creating a sense of paranoia among us. Even our flashlights seemed to flicker, casting a dim and unsteady light. We decided to leave the area and return to the camp, but as we retreated, the whispering voices seemed to follow us. Time seemed to drag on, and a feeling of oppression enveloped us. Our once lively group was now tense and apprehensive. Upon reaching the camp, the heavy atmosphere persisted. The whispering voices continued throughout the night, disrupting our sleep. When we woke up the next morning, the clearing had returned to its normal state, but the sense of unease lingered. We couldn't fully explain what had happened on that trip, and the experience left a lasting mark on our memories. Since then, we have never returned to that place, and the memory of the whispering voices and the eerie atmosphere still echoes in our minds.